Some careers are measured by trophies. Bob Saget knew that the real measure was whether the work still meant something when the room went quiet. Marilyn Monroe understood the trap of being too famous too fast. How the world decides who you are before you've had the chance to figure it out yourself. Sinead O'Connor never let the industry's expectations define her. She burned the script. Liam Payne rose to fame so young that the question of who he really was never had a quiet moment to be answered. Kirstie Alley spent decades in the public eye and understood something most stars don't. Longevity isn't given, it's fought for, role by role. Michelle Trachtenberg grew up on screen, navigating the narrow gap between being seen and being truly known. For 2 decades, one question followed Leonardo DiCaprio everywhere he went. Why hasn't he won? Not why hasn't he worked harder, or taken bigger risks, or made smarter choices. He'd done all of those things. The question was simpler and more corrosive than that. It was the question that turned a genuinely remarkable career into a public referendum on validation. And it told you something uncomfortable about how Hollywood decides who matters and when. That pressure didn't arrive from nowhere. It was built, brick by brick, by a series of performances so precise and so demanding that they forced the conversation. And it started long before anyone expected it to. DiCaprio was born on November 11, 1974, in Los Angeles. Not the glamorous part, but the gritty stretch of East Hollywood where his parents, George and Ermeline, split when he was still an infant. He grew up largely with his mother, shuttling between neighborhoods where success wasn't assumed and ambition wasn't inherited. His father, a counterculture figure who distributed underground comics, gave him a world of ideas. His mother gave him the discipline to do something with them. Neither gave him connections. What he had instead was an instinct. He started appearing in commercials and educational films as a child, the kind of unremarkable early work that fills the resumes of hundreds of children who never go further. But something in him knew the difference between performing and acting. His stepbrother Adam was already working in the industry, and watching that world up close, DiCaprio decided he wanted in. Not the fame version of it, but the craft version. That distinction would define almost everything that followed. His first real foothold came through the television series Growing Pains, where he joined the cast in 1991 as a homeless teenager taken in by the Seaver family. It wasn't a star-making role, but it put him in front of millions of viewers and gave him a professional rhythm. More critically, it showed producers that he could hold the frame. He was fired from a commercial at age 14 for refusing to follow direction, told his performance was wrong, and refusing to accept that judgment. The stubbornness that got him fired would eventually become his greatest professional asset. The pivot came in 1993. Robert De Niro was producing and starring in This Boy's Life, an adaptation of Tobias Wolff's memoir about an abusive stepfather and the boy who survived him. DiCaprio auditioned against hundreds of other young actors and won the role of Toby, the son. What De Niro brought out of him in that film, the feral energy, the suppressed terror, the flashes of dark humor, was something nobody had seen from him before. The film wasn't a massive commercial hit, but it put DiCaprio in a different category. People who watched it didn't forget it. That same year, he played Arnie Grape in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, a performance so internally inhabited, so specific in its physical and emotional choices, that his co-star Johnny Depp has spoken about being genuinely moved by it on set. DiCaprio was 19. He received his first Academy Award nomination, and then, in one of the stranger decisions in recent Hollywood history, he walked away from it. Not permanently, but deliberately. He had the momentum to play it safe, to take the prestige drama roles that would have solidified his critical standing. Instead, he veered into something messier. The Quick and the Dead, Romeo plus Juliet, Marvin's Room. He was searching for something, and he wasn't willing to let award season tell him what that was. Then came Titanic. James Cameron's 1997 film was, by almost any measure, an absurd production. The budget ballooned to $200 million, which at the time was an almost unimaginable figure. The shoot ran over schedule and over budget. Cameron was famously tyrannical on set. The studio was quietly panicking, and at the center of it all was a 22-year-old actor playing a fictional steerage passenger who falls in love with a first-class woman on a doomed ship. Titanic made DiCaprio one of the most famous people on Earth. It also nearly broke him. The film earned 11 Academy Awards and became the highest-grossing film of its time. Teenage girls plastered his face on their walls. He was everywhere, inescapable, the kind of famous that stops feeling like success and starts feeling like weather. And he didn't want it. Or more precisely, he didn't want only that. He turned down the sequel discussion, declined a string of blockbuster offers that would have locked him into a certain kind of stardom, and instead took 18 months away from film entirely. When he came back differently. The Beach in 2000 was a commercial film that connected to his existing audience. But it wasn't the real statement. The real statement was The Gangs of New York in 2002, when he walked into Martin Scorsese's brutally physical historical epic and held his own opposite Daniel Day-Lewis, widely considered one of the most intense performers of his generation. Day-Lewis was immovable, volcanic, commanding. DiCaprio matched him, scene by scene, in a way that announced something had shifted. The Scorsese partnership became the defining professional relationship of DiCaprio's career. They made The Aviator in 2004, a film about Howard Hughes that gave DiCaprio the chance to do something no blockbuster romance could, to play the disintegration of a man in real time. Hughes's obsessive-compulsive disorder, his paranoia, his genius. DiCaprio rendered them without caricature, without melodrama, with a terrifying internal logic that made the character feel like someone you recognized rather than someone you pitied. Another Oscar nomination, no win. The Departed followed in 2006, an ensemble crime film with Jack Nicholson, Matt Damon, Mark Wahlberg, and Alec Baldwin, in which DiCaprio played an undercover cop, unraveling under the weight of his double life. He was arguably the emotional center of a film full of scenery-chewing giants, and he held the whole structure together. Scorsese won Best Director. DiCaprio was not nominated. Blood Diamond came the same year, then Revolutionary Road in 2008, then Shutter Island in 2010, then Inception, a Christopher Nolan labyrinth that became one of the biggest films of the decade. He was in constant motion, making choices that were deliberately unpredictable, working with directors who demanded real things from him, and collecting a reputation for being the kind of actor who never mailed it in. And yet, the Oscar kept not coming. By 2012, when Django Unchained arrived, with DiCaprio playing the plantation owner Calvin Candy, a role he'd never attempted before, laced with a smiling sadism that was genuinely unsettling, the conversation around him had taken on a strange quality. People weren't just watching his performances anymore, they were measuring them against an invisible standard that kept moving. The Wolf of Wall Street, in 2013, was the film that fully fractured that narrative. Scorsese gave DiCaprio a character of almost cartoonish excess. Jordan Belfort, the real-life stockbroker who defrauded thousands of investors and lived in a baroque spiral of drugs, money, and amorality. And DiCaprio played him with complete physical commitment and zero apology. The film ran 3 hours. His performance ran at full throttle for all of it. Some critics were troubled by the film's refusal to editorialize. Some found it thrilling. Almost everyone agreed it was extraordinary. He was nominated again. He didn't win. The Revenant, in 2015, became something else entirely. A survival film directed by Alejandro González Iñárritu that required DiCaprio to spend months in extreme conditions, eating raw bison liver, submerging himself in icy rivers, filming in remote locations in Canada and Argentina. The shoot was brutal in a way that became part of the public story of the film. But what Iñárritu captured on screen was something that didn't need the backstory to justify it. Hugh Glass's will to survive, his grief for his murdered son, his wordless rage, was rendered in DiCaprio's body and face with an honesty that was almost uncomfortable to watch. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The acceptance speech was brief, genuine, and turned immediately toward climate advocacy, the cause that had, in parallel to his acting career, become his most sustained public commitment. DiCaprio had been involved with environmental causes since the late 90s, founding the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation in 1998, which has since granted hundreds of millions of dollars to conservation and climate projects around the world. He spoke at the United Nations. He produced and narrated Before the Flood, a climate documentary released in 2016 that reached an enormous audience through a partnership with National Geographic. He has been criticized by some for the perceived contradiction between his private life, the yachts, the private planes, and his public advocacy. He hasn't shied away from the critique, he's acknowledged it, even as he's continued the work. That tension between aspiration and reality, between public image and private complexity, runs through his career in ways that make him more interesting than a simpler version of the story would allow. In 2019, Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood gave DiCaprio a role that was, on its surface, lighter than anything he'd done in years. Rick Dalton, a fading television actor, convinced his best days are behind him, drowning in self-doubt and clinging to a world that is visibly ending around him. It was a performance of enormous wit and unexpected tenderness. There's a scene in the film where Dalton, alone in his trailer after flubbing his lines, breaks down in private, and the rawness of it, the complete absence of vanity, reminded audiences that DiCaprio had never actually stopped developing as an actor. He'd just been doing it in plain sight. Killers of the Flower Moon in 2023. Another Scorsese film, an adaptation of David Grann's devastating account of the Osage Nation murders in 1920s Oklahoma, placed DiCaprio inside one of the most morally complex characters he'd ever attempted. Ernest Burkhart, a white man who marries an Osage woman while participating, through willful ignorance and moral cowardice, in a systematic campaign of murder and theft orchestrated by his uncle. DiCaprio had to play complicity from the inside to make a man who enables atrocity legible without making him sympathetic. It was the kind of role that requires an actor to trust their instincts completely, because there is no technical shorthand for depicting culpability at that scale. The film was 3.5 hours long. DiCaprio was in nearly every frame. The reviews were serious, and the conversation was serious. Not the familiar oscillation between worship and backlash, but something more considered. He had by that point been in the conversation long enough that people were finally watching the work itself, rather than the narrative around it. He's in his late 40s now, still actively working, still navigating the strange space between icon and craftsman that he's inhabited since Titanic made both roles simultaneously available to him. The Oscar didn't resolve the question of what he is. It just changed the terms of it. What remains is the body of work, uneven in the way that all serious careers are uneven, marked by choices that didn't always pay off commercially, shaped by collaborators who pushed him past comfort, and animated by a genuine curiosity about what human behavior looks like from the inside. There are actors who arrive famous and stay that way without ever really threatening anything. DiCaprio is not that. He arrived famous, pulled back, pushed forward, made himself uncomfortable, made audiences uncomfortable, and built something that belongs in a different category than celebrity. The question was never really whether he'd win an Oscar. The question was whether he'd earned the right to be taken seriously. And the answer to that one was settled a long time ago.